The second section in Chapter 3, language learning attitude, starting on page 80. And we're interested, how quickly are people able to learn foreign languages? And I mentioned earlier in the discussion of tests, sort of language aptitude tests, and there's one from the 50s called Modern Language Aptitude Test, and there's one from the 60s, the Pimsleur Language Aptitude Battery, and these were a couple of tests that were supposed to kind of scientifically measure whether someone seems to be good at languages. I think probably a better test of someone's foreign language ability is to, put them in a course and then you just basically have to watch them and see how well they do. It's not a one-day test in that case, but that seems to be what I would consider more reliable way of figuring that out. And memory is important. People talk a lot about memory and learning. People have good memory, so they remember things for the test, or they have like super memory. Yeah, I mean, you think about that with foreign languages, all that vocabulary. But in terms of grammar, it doesn't seem to be as connected to memory, because grammar, it becomes a subconscious, automatic thing. So whereas, vocabulary seems to be that you can memorize vocabulary. But again, when you're in the situation, you're using the language, it's not like you're able to translate very quickly and come up with the word. I think all language has to become pretty much automatic anyway, through use and through practice. And we have what we call deductive versus inductive instructive. And deductive is where I very directly tell you, for example, the rule, and then you practice that grammar, and everything's straightforward. Inductive is where I kind of make the student think more. In language learning, it's if I, for example, let's say we read something, and then we kind of go backwards, like, what do you think is the grammar of that sentence? What do you think that word means? What do you guess that word means from the context of the sentence? And this inductive type of process just kind of related to critical thinking, which is making students sort of figure things out, be detectives a little more. And supposedly, like, over time, that's going to make the student remember that better, as opposed to just being kind of spoon-fed everything and expected to try to memorize it. And so you'll hear a lot about that. And going to the learning styles on page 83, this is where we try to identify a student if they have some natural preferred learning style, and how they process information, how they retain or remember the information. Do they want to hear a lecture? Do they want to figure it out for themselves? Do they want to write about it? Do they want to work in groups? Do they want to work alone? Do they need a lot of time? And probably the most popular learning style would be the auditory versus visual versus kinesthetic learning styles. And we think of the visual learner as the person who has to see something to remember it, or also usually they like to read and write. And we think of the auditory learner as someone who can just remember things when they hear them, and also probably likes to ask questions, discuss the things they're learning, and all that kind of fits into the auditory. And then the kinesthetic, which is probably the least classroom-friendly learning style, is the person who, kinesthetic person, they kind of like to learn by doing. They like to move. They like to touch things. They don't like to sit in a classroom. They don't like to sit in a chair. And they kind of like to learn on the job. And with language, that would be the person who, again, likes to learn language like more in a natural environment, and maybe they can't pay attention as well in the classroom as well. But in the classroom, sometimes the classroom is kinesthetic, like if you're doing art projects, making posters, working in groups, playing games, doing dramas. So we think a lot of those sort of movement activities benefit the kinesthetic learner as well. And then there's the field independent versus field dependent learner. I don't really hear as much about that in education, but I think the biggest application in language classrooms is that field independent, FI, is a student who can sit in a classroom and talk about grammar outside of the real language learning environment in the society, and they can talk about kind of like abstract ideas. They can talk about abstract things like that. Whereas the field dependent FD learner kind of has to see the big picture more. They have to see where everything fits in. And with language learning, they would do better outside the classroom and seeing how words and grammar are really used in real practice. But we think of the field independent learner as having advantages in the traditional classrooms as a learner. Finally, in this section, personality, like we talked about, someone being talkative or not, and or maybe like an adventurous person or a risk taker, because when you practice language, you think of adventurous people because of traveling, I guess, but also the risk taking means that you're going to make a lot of mistakes and errors when you're practicing language, and you have to have like a willingness to kind of embarrass yourself, and that's going to help if you have that kind of like easygoing personality where you're not always in control of everything, kind of like not like a control freak, I guess. Children have a good, you might say, personality for that because they're usually very busy and interactive, and they're not as embarrassed about making mistakes. Sometimes they have, whereas adults, we get a little bit more kind of in control of things. There's a funny reference here to alcohol, which I've seen in other language acquisition books, because alcohol takes away your inhibitions. So people talk about, when I have a drink, I can speak that foreign language better, or I can relax more. And so it's kind of funny, that correlation between using alcohol and taking away your inhibitions. And there could be some truth to that, but at the same time, obviously we're not going to use alcohol in the classroom. And also, some people joke about